Ori Berliner, welcome to Honestly.
Thanks, Barry.
So you published a pretty incredible essay in the Free Press this morning, which is all about how and why NPR has lost its way, National Public Radio. But unlike a lot of people that criticize NPR, you're not throwing stones from outside the castle. You are, by any stretch, a company man. You've spent the past 25 years of your career at NPR. Let's go back 25 years ago. What was NPR then, and why did Ori Berliner want to go and work there?
Well, I was one of those people who would wake up in the morning to NPR and hear those voices, Bob Edwards or a local host. The voice was reliable and calm, and it kind of set me up for the day. It just sort of gave me a sense of ballast and balance. When I would listen to the news, I felt it was reliable, but there were also these moments, flights of fancy, beautiful stories that would take me places like an Amazon rainforest, and I fell in love with it. I just thought, my God, it's so personal, but also so balanced in a healthy way.
You write, for the majority of your time at NPR, despite the liberal bend, an open-minded, curious culture prevailed. We were nerdy, but not knee-jerk activists or scolding. Ori, when did that start to change? When did the thing that everyone sort of recognized as sort of a liberal bias start to shift into what you call a knee-jerk activist and even scolding quality?
Well, I think it was cumulative. I don't think it was one event. Part of it was Trump's election. Like every newsroom, every legacy media newsroom, we were shocked, disturbed, distraught, really troubled. But I also think, to me, it revealed that we didn't really understand a lot of what was going on in America, that we were out of touch. But after a while, we started covering Trump in a way that we were trying to damage his presidency, to find anything we could to harm him. And I think what we latched on to was Russia collusion, like a lot of news organizations, which was, as I write, sort of catnip, although it was just rumors and a lot of it based on pretty shoddy documents, evidence. It wasn't really solid, but I think it was compelling. And for us, I think a lot of newspapers use documents or anonymous sources. We really latched on to Adam Schiff. He was like our muse to the Trump collusion story. We had him on constantly.
I bring in House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff. Congressman, good to have you back.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Democrat Adam Schiff of the House Intelligence Committee, who joined us once again. Congressman, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with
Congressman Adam Schiff is one of the lawmakers going to the White House today. He's chair of the House Intelligence Committee, and he is on the line with me now. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
And earlier today, we were able to catch California Congressman Adam Schiff as he was headed out of Washington.
Congressman Adam Schiff is on the line. He's the top Democrat on the House Committee investigating Russia's role in the 2016 election.
I think I counted 25 times. And in most of those conversations, he sort of alluded to evidence he may have had or sort of teased out, he was colluding or the campaign was colluding with Russia.
So do you agree that nothing happened from this meeting that we've been discussing all week?
Not at all. This is very significant. Here you have the Russians reaching out to the campaign, the very inner circle of the campaign.
And then the Mueller report came out and no collusion. And the story kind of disappeared. But to me, that was like a time for what went wrong? Why did we miss this? Despite our feelings about Trump, this is a story we should have sort of treated differently.
One thing that leapt out to me is if you look at the actual constituency that listens to NPR and how it breaks down politically, it has shifted dramatically. In 2011, you write that 37% of NPR listeners identified as liberal. 26% of listeners describe themselves as conservative, and another 23% is the middle of the road. So again, a liberal bent, but not overwhelmingly so. Last year, 67% of listeners describe themselves as very or somewhat liberal, 21% of the middle of the road, and only 11% as conservative. And not to overstate the single data point of my dad, but my dad is a conservative. He always would listen to NPR. He would roll his eyes once in a while, but he would reliably listen. And now he doesn't listen at all anymore. Is that something that you guys inside the NPR newsroom noticed? Is it something that you lamented?
I don't think it was taken seriously because, I think NPR was explicitly trying to reach a younger audience, and I think they thought the younger audience was progressive, which is not always the case. And I think that, it was so dramatic, but I think that it was also a part of a shift in the newsroom. So I don't think that there was an awareness or a sense that something had gone wrong. I think a lot of the newsroom, the perspective is progressive, and the fact that the audience was progressive was in sync with their outlook.
Do you see NPR and its shift to the left as sort of singular to that organization, or of a piece with a much broader trend that's happening inside legacy media institutions?
I think it's much broader within legacy media organizations. I think it's very commonplace. For me, what's different about NPR is we are a public service institution. We have a public mission, and we have a show called All Things Considered. We have a fellowship called the Reflect America Fellowship. So I think we have a particular obligation to reflect America, to understand people from all different outlooks, to bring up things that might be uncomfortable for our progressive audience members, to be a little more daring, to take a little more chance, to be more curious about things that don't fit the narrative. So I think at NPR was a particular problem because we're a public institution, and for years I think a lot of people felt NPR was like a national trust.
Anyone listening to this show is probably listening to this show because they've lost a little bit of faith, or a lot of faith, or a little bit of trust, or a lot of trust in the legacy media, in the old world. And if you ask people, a lot of their sort of moments are different. For some people, it happened over Trump. For other people, it happened over COVID and the way lockdowns were covered. And for other people, it happened over BLM. And there's that famous, infamous CNN chyron in which a newscaster is standing in front of giant flames in Kenosha, and the words at the bottom of the screen are, mostly peaceful protests. So for a lot of people, it happened over BLM. And those sort of stations of the cross, if you will, are all covered in your essay. And I wanted to start with the biggest one, the one you already mentioned, which is Trump, and the way that NPR and the NPR newsroom felt they needed to cover Trump. Now, you, Ori, are not a fan of the former president, obviously. You voted against him twice. But you had a problem with the way that NPR covered his presidency. Here's what you write in the essay. What began as a tough, straightforward coverage of a belligerent, truth-impaired president veered toward efforts to damage or topple his presidency. Tell me about what that looked like, Ori, on the inside.
Here was a president who, I believe was belligerent and ill-informed and not a good person by any standard measure of decency, but I think we developed a different standard of coverage for Trump than any other politician. And I think that led us to serious problems in our coverage. I mean, one of them was not so much about Trump, but connected to Trump was the Hunter Biden laptop, where, one of our top news manager, when the Post published this explosive story, said, we're not going to cover this. We're not going to cover stories that aren't stories. And we're not going to let our audience be distracted by this. And, this was right before the election. And I remember a conversation with a group of us, and, one of the great journalists at NPR, someone who was very fair-minded, said, look, I'm glad we're not covering this because it could help Trump. And this was when I think things were going off the rails in terms of the basic standards of how we cover politicians and stories.
I want to just read that line to you because it's one of the more explosive lines in your essay. You say, I listened as one of NPR's best and most fair-minded journalists said it was good we weren't following the laptop story because it could help Trump. By that point in his presidency, how normalized had that sort of attitude become? Were you the only one, or were there other people there who heard a statement like that and thought, wait, what business am I in?
I really don't know. I mean, I think we do get siloed. NPR is a pretty big organization. I'm not there at all conversations and meetings, especially, covering politics. So I don't really know, but just sort of when it comes to the hallway discussions, it was just such a loathing of Trump that, look, I think that existed in every newsroom, that was just the way it was.
How much of this is just a reality of groupthink? Because I think a lot of listeners or readers on the right will hear you describe this and think, aha, look, there was a conspiracy. But I think others that have been in that kind of environment think that's just the reality of being in an environment where everyone has the same background, votes the same way, and thinks the same way.
Yeah, no conspiracy. I think it's totally a matter of groupthink. You coalesce around people with similar views. It's uncomfortable to stand out. People might censor themselves, I don't know, but there's a consensus that builds and it has momentum and it becomes the way things work.
So you mentioned Adam Schiff before. You say that NPR had him on no fewer than 25 times. And here's what you write. The shift talking points became the drumbeat of NPR news reports. In other words, this idea that Trump was either somehow colluding with Russia or was somehow a Russian foreign agent, that was broadly, to be crude about it, the Schiff view. Then ultimately, the Mueller report comes out, and the report found that there was simply no credible evidence of collusion. Was there any moment of searching or self-reflection or apology that issued forth from NPR?
I don't know if there was any moment of self-reflection. There was nothing public, and I didn't see anything in our coverage that said, you know what, we got this wrong. Let's dive into this or see what fell apart with the Russia collusion story. Let's dig into that really hard. We didn't do that. I think more of what happened was we just let it go. You know, the report is out. Let's move on to the next thing.
Okay, well, the next thing was COVID, of course. And you note that in a similar way to the way that coverage of Trump hardened along a particular ideological orthodoxy, the same thing happened around COVID concerning masks, vaccine mandates, and of course the origin of the virus.
One of the early conspiracies about the coronavirus was that it was leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China. But now a team of international scientists from the World Health Organization has said that is very unlikely. They are just completing an investigation into the origins of the virus and came out with their findings today. NPR's Emily Fang is
the theory, if people can sort of cast their mind back to March of 2020, is that the idea at the time that COVID had come from a lab in Wuhan was something that was considered xenophobic, maybe at best, racist, an outlandish conspiracy theory. Here's what you write. The lab leak theory came in for rough treatment almost immediately, dismissed as racist or as a right-wing conspiracy theory. Anthony Fauci and former NIH head Francis Collins, representing the public health establishment, were its most notable critics, and that was enough for NPR. We became fervent members of Team Natural Origin, even declaring that the lab leak had been debunked by scientists. But that wasn't the case at all. As evidence emerged, of course, that the lab leak was a likely source of the origin of the virus, which I think now is broadly the consensus, did that shift? Was there any kind of reckoning? And looking back, doesn't it seem strange that the more racist theory was not the theory that people go to a wet market and eat sullied animals?
Right.
It always struck me as so strange that that was considered the more politically correct narrative.
Totally. I mean, and here we had a lab that was, or whatever happened, they were trying to do research to prevent coronaviruses, and they were doing it with some cooperation of the U.S. So, I mean, that doesn't seem like, you know, that seems like actual legitimate research. They may have had a leak, but it seems less racist than saying it came out of a wild animal market.
Tell me a little bit more, if you could, Ori, about what the conversation around COVID was like in the newsroom. So I remember, for example, in my own experience, when Tony Fauci admitted that he had told a noble lie early on in the pandemic in order to make sure that there were enough N95 masks for first responders. If you recall, they were saying to people in the beginning, you know, you don't need masks, when in fact, of course, you did, because they were worried about a shortage. Now, maybe if I were in the same position, I would have told the exact same noble lie. But I remember that being an early moment for me of, hold on. You know, the establishment is telling us, you know, Tony Fauci is the science. You need to trust everything he says as if it's the writ of God, with a lot more skepticism. You know, I would love any stories that you could tell us about the way that you guys covered COVID and maybe your own skepticism inside that context.
You know, we had Fauci on a lot, and I think that the perspective of Fauci and a lot of public health experts was that we're going to get rid of this virus and we're going to do everything we can. We're going to lock it down. We're going to have quarantines, we're going to have mask mandates, vax mandates. And what I think got lost is the sense that there are trade-offs. You know, at the heart of journalism is understanding that any policy, any event, you know, and especially any policy, there are going to be benefits and costs. And now we know that there were serious trade-offs, like damage to school children who lost years of their education, or people who couldn't visit loved ones, or surgeries that weren't done, or chemotherapy that wasn't provided. And why we sort of became blinded to that, I think that was really troubling. Like, and I'm not going to say that I wasn't thinking that way too. It was very pervasive, but it, you know, at a certain point, we understood, like, we would go to the public health experts, the Tony Fauci's of the world, and a lot of other people who were very prominent in creating the policy, but we'd never talked to someone like Jay Bhattacharya, who you had on quite a bit, who was saying, look, we should treat this differently, protect the vulnerable, go on with normal life. I don't think we would have entertained that idea because we were so bought into the idea of the institutional policies about dealing with COVID. And this was the problem, is that I think we didn't have this sort of spacious outlook that we were going to consider multiple perspectives on this, and which would have been incredibly valuable at the time to say, okay, here's Tony Fauci, here's Jay Bhattacharya, and leave it to our listeners, intelligent people, to come up with their own conclusions and views on things. But, I think we were sort of more guiding the coverage to the public health viewpoint, represented by Fauci.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about how things heated up at NPR following the killing of George Floyd. So you write that NPR's former CEO, a guy called John Lansing, encouraged sort of an activist mentality in the newsroom. He wrote this in a note to staff: when it comes to identifying and ending systemic racism, we can be agents of change. Listening and deep reflection are necessary, but they're not enough. They must be followed by constructive and meaningful steps forward. I will hold myself accountable for this. Now, lots of CEOs, not just at news organizations, but lots of corporate CEOs were putting out very similar statements at the time. Some went even further than Lansing does in that note. But tell me about why you decided to include that in the essay, and why that kind of statement from the head of a news organization, especially like NPR, surprised you.
Look, it's understandable. These were incredibly painful, awful times, and the murder was horrific. And it was understandable, I think, that he would have that perspective and expression. But, ultimately, when you look back on it, it's a pretty big thing to say that America is infected with systemic racism. That's a big deal to say that. And I think it would have been the right time to investigate that. To what extent is America infected with systemic racism in housing or law enforcement or education? That would be a great starting point for reporting, looking for evidence, figuring out, is this true? Is it not true? To what extent? But I think sort of a tone had been set instead.
You write about how following the murder of George Floyd, diversity, let's say, or anti-racism became the North Star, in a way, of NPR's staff and maybe also its coverage. You talk about how there were regular meetings about race and the number of sort of affinity groups exploded at the company. Tell us a little bit about all of that and how things shifted in the aftermath of what happened to George Floyd.
Well, I think that Lansing was a very strong advocate for what he called the North Star, which was that NPR's mission was to diversify its audience and diversify its staff, which is, I think, totally understandable at that moment in time. And, as you mentioned, this, I think, was very much in sync with what was going on in the rank and file, where it was a priority for our union to diversify our staff, which, again, I think was totally fine. But what was lost is a broader definition of diversity, which is, let's really be diverse in terms of people's perspectives and outlook as well. And I think also we had, in the aftermath of that, and I think probably this was happening anyway, but like a lot of groups within NPR that were clustered around identity, whether it was race or religion or sexual orientation, that this is a way for people to be with other like-minded people, but also to advocate for particular perspectives within the organization.
One of the ways that things shifted at NPR, and I think this is one of the most notable parts of the essay, is that you explain how NPR journalists and producers came to be required to ask everyone they interviewed about their race and their gender and their ethnicity, and that they had to enter this information into a tracking system. First, tell me about that tracking system and what that looked like.
Well, that's exactly what it is. When you do an interview, you enter information about race, ethnicity, age, geographical location, and it's meant to look at the perspective of our sources in terms of various characteristics, and that's been a priority for several years now. I wouldn't have had a problem with it if we were also trying to figure out people's perspective, their viewpoint. And I didn't love it, but I also think it was very limited. If we were going to do it, let's go all the way.
I think the thing listeners are going to wonder, Ori, is like, are you the single person at a very large news organization that felt uncomfortable or felt like, hey, this isn't core to our mission? Or were there other people, other sort of like thought criminals who, if not publicly proclaiming so, at least were sort of talking privately about the changes that you guys are seeing all around you?
I think there were some people who were quietly, maybe in a text group talking about this. But NPR, for better or worse, is a collegial, cooperative, conflict-averse place. And I think to raise this kind of thing is to do something pretty different within NPR because, I think the way that the place operates is really congenial. But in that congeniality, what you lose is the friction of differing opinions and people saying, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that policy, or where's the evidence, or the things that people do when they have really intellectually honest disagreements. I think we lose a lot of that.
In the summer of 2021, along with other news organizations, again, we're talking about NPR because that's where you've been for the past 25 years, but a lot of these stories are not specific to NPR. NPR updated its ethics policy and it removed a prohibition that kept journalists from demonstrating or protesting. The new policy allowed journalists to be involved in activities that advocate for, and I quote, the freedom and dignity of human beings. I mean, I remember in the sort of summer of 2020 how shocking it was because, I came up under old school journalistic rules. You don't donate to campaigns, you don't march on behalf of political causes. A lot of the journalists I look up to have never voted in an election because they understand that we are subjective people, that we all have our biases, but they want to maintain as much objectivity as possible. And I was looking at Instagram stories the other night and I noticed a writer that I always read in the New Yorker, with her baby at a anti-Israel protest, waving a Palestinian flag. And I'm like, wow, like that's just going to color the way that I read her stories, seeing that. And, that has just become something that is now extremely normative among legacy journalists. And it's a shift that I think is actually like quite profound.
I totally agree. I think that there are a lot of journalists now who feel like they are obligated to do stories that are aligned with their sense of justice or to try and undo power structures. And if that means forgetting about the traditional values of fairness or objectivity, so be it, as long as the objective is to change the world in the way that these journalists want. To me, I think the idea, I'm probably an old-fashioned fuddy-duddy, but the idea that what we do in journalism is we have our opinions and we have our outlook, but we try and park them to the side. That's basically the starting place for the job. I mean, I think of the Sebastian Junger, the great quote about journalism. He said, genuine journalists are willing to destroy their opinions with facts. And we see the opposite now often, is that opinions are pushed the story and that facts are ignored if they're inconvenient or they undermine the narrative.
6 months since the war between Hamas and Israel began, and I want to talk a little bit about the way that NPR has covered that war. I'll give you a few little anecdotes.
The Israeli military killed many Hamas fighters that day also and still holds those bodies. NPR's Greg Myrie
NPR frequently refers to Hamas terrorists as militants and fighters.
The death toll from fighting between Israeli forces and Hamas fighters is climbing. More than 1,200 Israelis are known dead after that surprise attack by Hamas.
Even when our own defense secretary in America, Lloyd Austin, has referred to Hamas as terrorists. On October 12th, 5 days after October 7th, this is how NPR described the attack. The war was sparked by a surprise attack from Hamas that saw fighters flow into Israel on trucks and paragliders. It has left at least 1,300 people dead in one of the worst attacks in Israel's history. So there's no mention of innocent civilians, no mentions of the brutality, and few details about 10/7, and they jump right to this. Israel's retaliatory airstrikes have killed almost as many Palestinians in Gaza in 6 days of war. More than half are women and children, and many are still buried under the rubble. How do you understand NPR's coverage of the war, and has it surprised you at all?
I don't think it surprised me. I think in a lot of respects it's been really troubling. I do remember just on October 10th, this was 3 days after the attack, when Israel has not responded. This was in our union chat group. We had one journalist saying, let's use this guidance from this Middle Eastern journalism affinity group about the language we use describing this war that's about to start. And I said, no, we should not get our guidance from journalism advocacy groups. I don't think we should get our guidance from the ADL. No, we need to make our own decisions about how we cover this. I got a lot of pushback. People saying, no, this isn't political. This is just using the precise language. But it was a very tense exchange.
Here's something that you write about the war in your essay. We've approached the Israel-Hamas war and its spillover onto streets and campuses through the intersectional lens that has jumped from the faculty lounge to our newsrooms, oppressor versus oppressed. That's meant highlighting the suffering of Palestinians at every turn while downplaying the atrocities of October 7th. It's meant overlooking how Hamas intentionally put civilians in peril and giving little weight to the surge of anti-Semitic hate that has spread around the world. I thought that was really powerful. I guess I wonder, we've talked a bunch about affinity groups. Is there a Jewish affinity group or a pro-Israel affinity group where people have gathered to express their real concern about the direction that NPR is headed, or at the very least the way that it's been covering the war?
Yeah, there is one. And I think that, the Jewish affinity group, we've had some meetings, with senior managers, and that has been expressed. So I do want to acknowledge that, but I don't think it has changed the coverage. I would like to sort of focus on the surge of anti-Semitism. And to me, this is probably the most troubling thing because, in the weeks immediately following October 7th, we saw Jewish students being locked into the library where pro-Palestinian protesters banging on the door. We saw "Glory be to the martyrs" projected on a school building. We saw posters of kidnapped children and elders being ripped down. And we really didn't cover this sort of stunning outburst of anti-Semitism for a number of weeks. And the first story of any significance that we did on anti-Semitism was a story about Jews, pro-ceasefire Jews, getting a bunch of crap from their Zionist relatives. And that was like the first story we did about anti-Semitism of any significance. And to me, it was like, what is going on here? It was like, and I brought this up. This was one of the things I brought up with our senior news executives. And, I will say, when I bring these things up, everyone's polite. It's a good point. I understand your perspective, but I don't think things change.
Nellie used to joke that my part-time job was editing and writing for the New York Times, but my full-time job was writing these internal emails and memos. I probably wrote hundreds of thousands of words to the masthead of the New York Times while I was there, desperately trying to say, guys, don't you see where this is going? How much of your time has been spent over the past few years trying to appeal to leadership inside the news organization? Do you think any of it was effective?
I've spent a lot of time on this. For the past 3 years, I think it's really ratcheted up. At one point, I got so frustrated with what I saw was the lack of different perspectives in our coverage that I decided to look at voter registration, among our staff. And so I found that I looked at DC, where it was fairly easy to access voter registration records. And what I found was 87 registered Democrats on our editorial staff, 0 Republicans. I presented this at a all-hands or a large news meeting, and I said, hey, look, something's gone wrong here if we're really thinking about diversity in our coverage. Something is really off if we have 87 Democrats and 0 Republicans. And, the response wasn't like, wow, it wasn't like we're going to change this or try and address this. And it was just more like, wow, that's weird. How did that happen? Or, and it was really weird.
One of the things I was struck by in reading your essay, because it just so resonated with my own experience, was about how truth was something that already was known. And the job of people in the newsroom was just to convince the audience of that truth. Here's what you write. There's an unspoken consensus about the stories we should pursue and how they should be framed. It's frictionless. One story after another about instances of supposed racism, transphobia, signs of a climate apocalypse, Israel doing something bad, and the dire threat of Republican policies. It's almost like an assembly line. The mindset prevails in choices about language, you write. Heeding advice from activists, we are instructed to avoid the term biological sex. The mindset animates stories that are bizarre on how the Beatles and bird names are racially problematic, and others that are alarmingly divisive, like justifying looting, with claims that fears about crime are racist, and that Asian Americans who oppose affirmative action have been manipulated by white conservatives. And I guess the thing I was thinking as I was reading that is, what has it felt like to you to be out of step with the prevailing ethos? You know, again, to remind people, you're not a Republican, you're not a conservative, you voted against Trump twice, but you are, I would say, a liberal in the most classic sense of that word. And, you know, you're in an environment, it sounds like, of increasingly ideological people who maybe identify themselves as liberal, but are maybe something much harder ideologically than that liberal in the capacious sense of the word. Like, has the experience of being out of step been painful for you? Has it been hard? It's never a fun thing to feel like you're out of step with the people around you.
I would say it's been very painful because I like my colleagues. I like working at NPR. It's been my home for 25 years. I've had wonderful experiences there, great colleagues, that I've worked closely with. And it's been very hard. And, I think it's been a little lonely. I think I have a few people I can confide in, but I've been very public, and a lot of us working remotely or in different places. There's not as much newsroom interaction, so I don't really know how I'm viewed. But yeah, it's been painful, and especially because I do love NPR, and I've been a lifer, 25 years. I believe in the mission, and to see it get, I think, distorted in this way is hard. And I also feel like what we haven't really talked about, what I would like to talk about, is that as this has happened in both the legacy media and also in conservative media, people don't like us. They don't trust us anymore. They don't believe in what we're selling. And the numbers, I think, are remarkable. And I think it's something that's not really discussed or acknowledged, how severe this is, how, I think it's now like the Gallup poll, about 30% of people believe, that the media will report fully, accurately, and fairly. And I think that NPR is no different, that the level of trust has just plummeted. And I think understandably so. And I'm not just talking about legacy media of all kind, like, the idea that we are trying to push an outlook. We're trying to shove this into our audience and make them think a certain way. And I think it turns a lot of people off.
What are the stakes of that? What does it mean to live in a country in which the media overwhelmingly, it's not that they've just lost trust in a vacuum. They've lost trust because these places have proven themselves to not be trustworthy. People have eyes and ears to see and hear, and they know what they're seeing with their eyes, and they're hearing something really different, either from NPR or the Times, the Washington Post, not to pick on NPR, it could be any of these places. So what are the stakes of it? What does it mean to live in a country where there's plummeting trust in the press?
It's incredibly harmful, and it's frightening, and I think that media organizations are going to be smaller and smaller and aligned toward very hardened views. And I think it's going to be bad for their business, but more it's bad for the soul of the country. And I don't know where this goes, but I don't think it's going to go someplace good. And I think, there are independent, heterodox news organizations like yours, and there are other Substacks and other ways to get, I think, very interesting, compelling journalism that's independent. But I don't think it replaces, institutions that have lots of resources and the ability to cover a story anywhere around the world or anywhere in any city. I don't think it replaces that. I don't think that it's a good idea to sort of just write off all these institutions and say that, we should tear them down, because it's important to have news organizations that are of some size and some capacity. People have a basic faith that the story is right.
So if the solution isn't to tear things down, and NPR, it's about to have a new CEO, wanted to right itself, what are the first three things that it should do?
I think one crucial thing is, how do we recruit journalists? I think NPR journalists, like in most big legacy media organizations come from elite universities, have worked at other news organizations that have sort of progressive outlook. I think we should, forget that. If we really want to push the diversity envelope, let's recruit from state schools, from religious schools. Let's recruit people who've written for news organizations that are maybe conservative or libertarian. But I think really it's in recruiting. Maybe people who don't have a journalism background, a traditional journalism background, but have shown themselves to be good writers. But I think, why not recruit at a Christian college? I don't think there would be anything wrong with that. We recruit in all other kinds of places.
Okay, so that's first, recruit from different places. What else?
I think that there needs to be a return to sort of the basic principles of journalism, that we're fair in the most spacious kind of ways. And it should sort of be the sort of basic underpinning of what we do. We're curious. We're going to try and set our opinions aside. We're going to talk to people with all different outlooks. If we have a hypothesis for a story and the facts undermine that, we'll drop the story to try and be a little more like a scientist. I mean, definitely more rigorous in what we do. And, just this idea that we should shed our opinions. It's just like that should be the basic value of what we do.
While the amount of public funding that NPR receives is often overstated by critics who want that funding to end, it does receive, I think, $3 million a year in direct federal funding, and it also receives about $90 million a year from member stations that get their own varying amount of public funding. So I guess I want to ask, after what you've seen and sort of what we've been talking about today, do you think that should end, or do you support the idea that NPR should continue to get taxpayer funds?
I don't think it should end. I think that the NPR is still an incredibly valuable public institution. I think it needs serious fixing, but I think there are member stations in small towns and remote areas that rely on this money to provide local news coverage. I think it's pretty critical. So I wouldn't support defunding NPR.
Ori, you're such a restrained and sober and moderate person, and yet you've done something today that's a pretty big deal. You have worked at a place for 25 years, and you've just published a big essay in the Free Press, openly criticizing, if not the place itself, certainly the direction where it's heading. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all. However, I think that my views are well known within NPR by top news managers and many other people. And I've been hammering away at these things for years and years, and nothing has changed. And I felt like maybe it's better to be public about this than to be quietly bringing this up in the halls of the newsroom. Let's try being open about this. I mean, we are a public news organization. I say, if anybody should have this kind of reckoning or really hard scrutiny of what we are, it should be NPR. We've got public in our name, National Public Radio.
What do you think the reaction will be? Because I'm just thinking, if you work for JP Morgan and you published a big essay criticizing JP Morgan, you probably get an email saying, you're out. Like, it's a big deal to write an essay like this. So, most people, when they spend 25 years at a place, will say, I've done my best. Let me go enjoy, let me take up biking or tennis, or I'm going to keep my head down. What's the point in causing trouble for myself? You didn't make that choice.
Well, you really hit a sore spot with me, because I love biking and I love tennis, and I would love to be doing those things right now. Believe me. I just felt obligated to do this. I think the stakes are high. I felt, this was a sense of duty to be open and public about this. If people disagree with me, that's totally fine, but I didn't think I should go out quietly.
Well, Ori Berliner, I commend you for writing such a strong and powerful and bold essay. Everyone who is listening should head over to the Free Press's website, thefp.com, and read it in full. We'll also put it in the show notes. Ori Berliner, thank you so much for joining me on Honestly.
Thank you, Barry.